Thank you everybody for tuning into breakout session number 2 of day 2, advanced methods and models using ACS data. I'm going to bring us up to the first speaker right off the bat, Linda Gennarelli from the Urban Institute.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be talking to all of you this morning. So I am, I think someone is sharing the slides. Or should I be trying to do that?
Linda, why don't you try sharing your slides first, and then if it doesn't work, we'll put them up.
I may be able to, I think I have them if you want it. Do you have it? Oh, there we go. Let me move you.
I think
there we go.
Are you all seeing anything now?
Yes, I can see slides. I'm seeing them in, not in presentation view, but I do see your slides.
Let me try one more click. I'm running into, apologies to everyone, I'm running into something I'm not sure how to handle. I clicked the additional thing I thought might work, but if it is not working, then I'm not sure what to do.
We can try one of two things. So in the very bottom of the screen, there's bottom right-hand corner, there's the 72%, there's a slider, and then immediately to the left of that, there's a screen share to the left of the slider. It's a little icon. It looks like a desk, like a screen on a pedestal. That one. Let's try that. There we go. Now we see them. Perfect. Magic. Thank you, Linda.
Well, they could have made that a tiny bit bigger, but so welcome everybody, and thank you again for joining us. You can see that despite the fact that we may be able to create advanced models, sometimes little icons can still trip us up. So thank you and welcome. So the topic that I want to talk about today is how we make use of the wonderful ACS data to estimate how much policy changes could reduce child poverty using the ACS microsimulation model, which is a model that we have at the Urban Institute. So the context for this particular discussion is the current poverty rates, current and persisting poverty rates in the United States. Just looking at the official measure of poverty using the most recent 5-year ACS data, the poverty rate was measured at 12.6% for all people, but higher than that, 17% for children. So that's why in these examples, we're focusing on child poverty. There are lots and lots of policy ideas that have been put forward to potentially reduce poverty overall and child poverty. So I will not be using my 15 minutes to talk in detail about the policy aspects of those policy ideas, except to say that all kinds of ideas, from new or modified policies for cash or in-kind benefits, new or modified tax or tax credit policies, or even completely new programs. The focus of today is that policymakers need ways to help understand what the potential impacts of different kinds of policies are without actually implementing the policies. Obviously, the gold standard of research might be to test out certain policy ideas in a particular place and then look a few years later at what happened, but that is enormously expensive. So instead, policymakers need different ways to estimate how a particular policy might reduce poverty overall by different characteristics, maybe in a particular state. One important way of doing that is to use household survey data like the ACS. Specifically, starting with household survey data, then assessing poverty most likely with the supplemental poverty measure or the SPM, because that lets you look not only at the impact of changes in cash, either earnings or cash benefits, but also lets you look at the impact of changes in in-kind benefits. And finally, the piece that I'll be focusing on today is using a microsimulation model. A microsimulation model is a way of applying the rules of programs or policies to the household data, essentially just an enormous computer program, to look at the situation before the policy changes, then to run the model again with the policy changes and see how that changed families' economic well-being. A recent example of this, this combination of elements was used by the National Academy of Sciences in their Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty analysis. That analysis used a different simulation model, the TRIM3 microsimulation model, to assess the potential impacts of the policy changes put forward by the NAS panel. TRIM3, however, is applied to CPS data and therefore produces primarily national results. So today's focus is an ACS-based microsimulation model called ADIS, which stands for Analysis of Transfers, Taxes, and Income Security. So I want to start with a couple key points about the ADIS model, then move to 4 different examples of how we've used ADIS over the past several years to analyze child poverty reduction from different policies. Real-world COVID response policies, a $15 an hour minimum wage nationally, a package of proposed policies to reduce poverty in New York City, and our most recent analysis looking at the potential impacts of 100% participation and full funding across the social safety net focused on Illinois. And I'll just repeat the fact that it's the ACS data and its wonderfully large sample that allows us to do the analyses in a particular city or a particular state. The motivation and why I hope you all will be somewhat interested in this morning. First, if you see analyses like this saying this particular policy change could reduce poverty by this much, you might have a better sense of where these estimates are coming from. And secondly, if it gives you any ideas for your own research. So a few points on the ADIS model. As mentioned, it operates on the ACS data, allowing state and sub-state analysis. When I say that it is a simulation model, what I mean is that it simulates or mimics the operation of benefit and tax programs. The actual rules of the programs are applied to the households in the ACS data one at a time. Just as a caseworker would apply the rules of, would interview a family that applied for a program, or a tax preparer would ask you about your income and doing your taxes. Very, very detailed model, including state level rules as well as national, and picks up interactions across the programs. The overall system also includes the ability to age or project a survey data file to another year. And it also includes the ability to impose externally established labor supply impacts. Very comprehensive model. It covers all of the cash benefits, nutrition benefits, other subsidies, and tax programs that you see on this slide. I will just give you a moment to skim. So picks up all of those programs, their national and state rules, and their interactions. Two kinds of simulations we talk about in microsimulation modeling. One is a baseline simulation that uses real world rules for the program. And when we model a particular program at baseline, we're looking at who's eligible for that program, and then we're creating caseloads for that program that mimic the real world caseloads in terms of size and characteristics. For programs that are included in the ACS already, for instance, SSI, the simulations are correcting for underreporting. For programs that are not included in the ACS data at all, what the simulations are determining eligibility and then completely creating the simulated caseload from within the eligible households. Alternative simulations are just like what it sounds like, simulating not the real policies, but the hypothetical or proposed policies. So how we use the model to assess anti-poverty impact: we start from a set of baseline simulations. We compute the SPM poverty rates with the combination of the ACS data and the ADIS data. And we might get we will get a different SPM poverty rate than would be obtained just from the public use data because of the fact that we're using the simulated benefit data correcting for underreporting. Then we run the alternative simulation with the policy change, picking up all the interactions across programs, and we compute SPM poverty again with the modified data. So now we get into our examples. Here's an example from a few years ago where we applied ADIS to look at the impact of the COVID response policies in 2021. And we looked at SPM poverty rates with and without the responses by age group. The blue bar is what would poverty have been? What would SPM poverty have been in 2021 without any response, without any policies? And you could see it would have been very high. With the program changes, including, for example, much expanded SNAP benefits, as well as the greatly expanded unemployment benefits, poverty is down, was much lower than it would have been otherwise. And then the orange includes the stimulus payments. A key message from this analysis was that the response policies mattered a lot. That policy changes did make a difference, and particularly they made a difference for kids. You can see that because of all the policies, we estimated child poverty by the SPM measure at 5.6% in 2021, whereas otherwise it would have been it would have been at about 30%. Second example, a simulation, this was from about a year ago, a simulation of a nationwide $15 an hour minimum wage. SPM poverty before and after the change, again by age group. Here you see that the poverty reductions are a bit smaller. And there's two reasons for that. One is that in order to benefit from a $15 an hour minimum wage, you have to be working. And a lot of families with below poverty resources and kids in families with below poverty resources are not working or are not working full year. Obviously, another reason is that many states by 2022 already have minimum wages at or well above the federal minimum wage. So we also looked at this by state. You can see that, and this is showing the percent reduction in SPM poverty. You can see that one state had a percent reduction of more than 20%, whereas 3 states had less than a 10% reduction in poverty. And this was driven largely by what their state minimum wages were in 2022. Third example. This was actually from quite a few years ago. This was a project specifically in New York City, which we were able to look at with a single year of ACS data, both because the ACS is so large and also because New York City is so large. This was a big package of policies, and I try to ignore that little short bar over on the right and look at all the other bars. At baseline, we estimated SPM poverty at 21.8%. Each of the other bars is a policy option, from a transitional jobs policy, which we estimated would reduce child poverty to 14.9%, guaranteed child care subsidy in the next to the last bar, which we estimated would reduce child poverty only from 1.8 to 21.2%. But look what happens in that last bar. We combined all of New York City's the proposed policies for New York City. These were policies produced by a group of nonprofits. We combined all those policies, and the child poverty rate dropped to 6.1%. A key message here, which we've seen in multiple analyses, is that there are different reasons for families to have below poverty resources, low wages, not working, having adults who are not able to work due to age or disability, and that it takes combining policies hitting different reasons to substantially reduce child poverty. Last example, our most recent one, one other reason for poverty is that there are many families who are eligible for various safety net programs who do not receive them, either because the programs are not fully funded or because the families don't apply. We did a thought experiment. What if there was 100% participation as well as full funding across 7 safety net programs in Illinois? What would happen to poverty as measured with the SPM rate? You can see in the set of bars over at the right that our estimated child poverty rate in Illinois would fall from 11.3% to 6.2%. And over at the far left, you can see there's a very substantial reduction in deep poverty, or kids below half the threshold. We also looked at this by race. Very substantial reductions for all race and ethnicity groups, with the largest reductions for Hispanic kids and Black non-Hispanic children. Finally, I want to emphasize this is not my work. This is a very large team of us at the Urban Institute. These models, while they can be described in a few sentences, are very time intensive and resource intensive to develop and maintain. And everybody on this slide contributed to the work and to many of the analyses. Also want to acknowledge our funders, and also the good folks at University of Minnesota who facilitate access. And finally, links to the analyses and more information about ADIS. Thank you very much. And now we will see if I can successfully click the stop sharing button.
Thank you, Linda. And just a reminder to participants, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature on the side, and I will read out the questions at the end of all the sessions. So next up is going to be Julia Gutierrez from Wellesley College.
Julia, do you want me to share your slides for you? And Julia, you're on mute. Oh, I can see that you're speaking, but still can't hear you. Nope. It was working. It was working before. All right, Julia, I think we'll move you backstage and see if we can sort out the speaker. Do we want to go to next presentation?
Yes, we will jump to Nick Cruzcamp from RTI International.
Okay.
Oh, hi.
And Nick, do you want to try sharing your slides?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Do we see those slides?
I do. I see them in slide mode, not in present. There we go. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
Okay, great. Okay. Okay, so yeah, my name is Nick Cruzcamp. I'm from RTI International. We're located in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. And today we're going to do, I would say this is leaning closer towards a preliminary exploratory analysis. Of how we want to slice and dice, or how are we able to spatially disaggregate ACS data. Let me see. Oops. There we go. So to give a little bit of background, we understand that ACS data and census data are generally served out and delivered, at least a lot of the way I access it is at a geographic level. And so these are generally anywhere from blocks and block groups to tracts to counties, all the different ways that we can access census data. And a lot of times we're able to use census data in that form and do analysis at that geographic level. But there are other times when we need to essentially take our census square peg and fit it into a round hole, and that is some sort of externally defined geographic shape. And one of the primary ways that this has been done is called aerial interpolation, and that is to say we're going to calculate the percent of overlap between, let's say, a census tract and our user-defined shape or polygon in space. And we're going to use that percentage as a way to pull in the census data to our new shape. And I'm going to show some examples. I know that maybe sounds a little bit abstract without looking at some maps, but we will absolutely look at some maps here in a second. But one of the things that occurred to us, and I know has been identified in the literature as being a challenge, is that generally this assumes a uniform spatial distribution of a variable. And so when we think more concretely about that, let's think about how population, for example, is distributed across a city or even within census tracts. Do we assume that there is exactly, one person per square meter distributed across the entire shape? No, we know that's not the case, that people tend to cluster and aggregate in certain areas and not in others, some obvious being parks and green spaces. And so one of the counters to that, I'm going to call this population density weighted interpolation. And that is to say that we are going to take some sort of third data source and try to weight our averages when we take, say, data from census tract and try to put it into a user-defined shape. We're going to follow the population density in our application here as a way to not apply a uniform spatial distribution of a variable. And so again, we're sort of exploring this thought and wanted to prove to ourselves, does it matter? And if so, by how much? And is there more to maybe be gleaned from this sort of analysis than we initially thought? Originally we said, well, we're gonna take some population distribution surface and we're gonna, throw that in there as opposed to assuming uniform distribution. But what we began to find pretty quickly is that, or what we wanted to ask was, does the source geographic level matter in estimating population totals or other ACS variables, for example? So does it matter if it's a block group? Does it matter if it's a tract? Does it matter if it's a place or an MSA? And then based on the geographic levels that we're exploring, does the population density weighted interpolation actually provide better results than simple aerial interpolation? And our motivation behind this is looking at place-based community violence interventions primarily. And so what we need to do is look at treatment and control communities. These are places where some sort of violence intervention has been enacted, and these are normally based out of communities. And in our case, our city area is Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the way that these communities and the interventions have been divided up are in these neighborhood boundaries or communities across Milwaukee, and they do not align with the ACS geographic boundaries. So, again, how do we take block group, track, or place ACS values and create neighborhood level estimates? And we've got a couple examples to show of how that looks. And so here is one example where we have in green a block group that overlays in red hashed one of the Milwaukee neighborhoods. And so we see in this example where the red square or the red rectangle and the green shape overlay, we need to be able to understand how much of that green shape contributes to the population in the red. And you can imagine, again, this is just two variables. There would be total coverage of these green shapes, and I'll show another figure here in just a moment. So, but in order to understand our violence interventions, we need to know what the population characteristics based on ACS data are in that red area. So again, our use case is Milwaukee neighborhoods, and in the orange outlines, we see the neighborhoods themselves. Now, they're roughly the size of block groups, but again, the way that they're divided up across space does not align very well with the block groups. And so the survey data that we have used, we're actually looking at a time series component. I'm not going to explore that too much here today. But for the geometries where we pulled ACS data, we looked at block group track and place level estimates. The track and place level estimates were available from 2010 to 2020. The block groups didn't become available until 2013. And just for the demonstration purposes today, we wanted to look at just our total population, because that presumably tracks very well with estimates of population distribution. Now, of course, there'll be an outstanding question of, do other ACS variables, race, sex, and others, track with the distribution of population? Again, there's probably a lot of outstanding questions about how well those two distributions align. And we did all our work, just as a shout out to the census for the wonderful API. We accessed it through the census data package in Python, as well as all the analysis. And so we have messed with the idea of maybe releasing our own version of this. There are a couple sort of aerial interpolation packages, but in order to do the comparison and the population density weighting in Python. And so the population density distribution grids that we use as our reference, we pulled from WorldPop. And there are a number of different population distribution grids out there. WorldPop was attractive because it had moderate resolution and was available through time. And I should say, They have a couple different methods of estimation. We use the unconstrained because that was available on a yearly basis. If you were targeting a specific year where they have maybe more high fidelity products, that would also be an option. And I will say that WorldPop produces a pixel per person estimation. In our case, we're only using the relative counts within each of our shapes. And so again, the aerial interpolation problem is what percent of total source, in our case, source being the census geometries, fall within the target geometries. And so in the figure here, we see the target in our orange and our source census geometries in purple outlines. And so the aggregation or sum of all the contributing areas from purple to orange in this figure would give us our orange estimation. Whereas with the population weighted interpolation, we want to say, well, what percentage of the total census tract population, according to this auxiliary variable or the population distribution for WorldPop, falls within that target geometry. And so getting a little bit into the original data that we pulled down from ACS, here's the 2020 population estimates across the three different geometry levels that we pulled in. And so you can see how, as you disaggregate the population, the distributions change a little bit. But broadly, the totals add up. And again, I mentioned that when we were looking at estimates through time, there is sort of an interesting component that may or may not be something I have done wrong, admittedly. But we noticed that when we just try to sum up our population estimates through time, we get this period of time where our estimates are very close, and this sort of inflection point where we tend to underestimate the populations. And so as a reference for this graphic, the 0 would be what is the Milwaukee place estimate, because the place shape aligns almost perfectly with the way that Milwaukee divides up their neighborhoods. Versus if we were to do our interpolation based on our three different sources, block, group, track, or place. So we're undercounting by a little bit, but as a total percentage of the population, it's not a terrible estimate considering the methods that we're using here. So based on that, we said, what is the population density weighted interpolation value of our estimates based on the source? So when we take our place, what do our estimates look like? When we take track data, what does our estimates look like? And when we take our block groups. And so this was very encouraging to say that if you are only concerned with getting reasonable estimations of some target geometry, our Milwaukee communities, that any level of ACS geometry or census geometry and ACS variable is going to give you a relatively close estimate regardless of the level of geometry that you choose. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting result. I expected to see different distributions across here, but the correlation among these three variables was very high. They all tended to give very similar results to each other. So the next question, of course, was, well, does aerial interpolation and does population density weighted interpolation give us those same estimates? And this is where we see some interesting results among the three different census geometry levels. When we do this and compare the method results at the place level, we see that the aerial interpolation estimates do not correlate well with the population density weighted estimates. But when we get down to smaller geographies, that of track and block group, aerial weighted interpolation and population density weighted interpolation correlate very strongly. Place was about 0.5 of Pearson's R, track was 0.95, and block group was 0.98. And so what that's telling us is that as we use smaller and smaller geometries to slice and dice our ACS variables, the difference between a more advanced method of population density weighting and aerial interpolation really starts to not matter that much. And so, interestingly, there is a space component or a spatial component at play here that matters. And here is the distribution of differences between the two methods. I do want to highlight, and I've had this little warning on some of these slides, that the color scales are different. They're all stretched individually. And just to highlight that case, that when we look at the differences between the two methods at the block group level, our differences are within about 2,000 people maximum, plus or minus, whereas at place, our aerial weighted interpolation would underestimate populations by up to 20,000 in certain areas and overestimate by up to 10,000 in other areas. So here is where we see significant spatial differences. And this is where I have started to do, and I say this as an exploratory analysis, some more exploring on the spatial aspects of these data. What I am interested in understanding is how the uniform distribution of populations at a very local scale matters. And so what this black and white image shows is how closely related are certain observations to the ones that are very near them. And that would suggest that only in places where we see distribution significantly different from uniform within the local neighborhood that we can see here, will it matter? So if I were to estimate the population for this central rectangle here, even though we see, across larger spaces that population is not evenly distributed, within its local neighborhood, it's relatively uniform. And so that would suggest it doesn't matter if we're using aerial or population weighted interpolation. And so, generally, there's this very strong correlation among population estimates from any level of geometry considered, but that we find that when we actually look at aerial and population weighted interpolation, smaller geometries are going to reduce the difference between those methods. So we really have to understand how much does our distributions differ from uniform, and that gives us a greater understanding of their impacts. And I'm going to wrap it up there.
Thank you, Nick. And I'm going to jump back to Julia Gutierrez from Wellesley College for her next presentation. And just a reminder as we're getting this set, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature, and I'll read them out at the end. I might miss some if they're coming in through the live chat.
Julia, do you want to try sharing slides, or do you want me to?
You can share them, please.
Okay. Are you able to see? Whoops, I need to move her backstage. Are you able to see slides? It might be in notes view still.
Yes, you are in notes.
Are you able to see slide view now? Nope, is it still notes?
Yeah.
Okay, let me try one more time. I was going to try to share just the window, and it doesn't want to work. How about now?
Yes, that works.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here today. The title of my presentation is called A Feminist Methodological Approach to Develop a Multidimensional Poverty Index for the West Side of Chicago. Just a few disclaimers. This project, it's a mixed methods project where I'm bringing qualitative methods and quantitative methods. In the quantitative methods component, this is where I will be using the ACS dataset. Also, this project is very early it's in its very early stages, in its infancy stages. I had started this project a few months ago, so it's still in the works. You can go next. Click next. So this project stems from work that I have previously conducted in regards to poverty, and specifically on the south side of Chicago. And one of the quotes that really captures the importance of understanding how poverty is currently being measured has the official poverty measurement doesn't always account for individuals who might be experiencing poverty in non-monetary ways. So this quote from one of the participants mentioned, we identify as poor because of the money we earn, not because of the way we live. So here we see this dual comparison of monetary deprivation, income, right? How much money they earn versus the way that they live. So experiences that cannot always be measured, or how they both should be in collaboration. Next. And this is a picture of one of the participants who strategically implements some of her skills to earn an income. I think this centerpiece was only $8 and it took her only 3 hours to make. So my project really aims at creating a measurement that captures both how people are living in monetary deprivations and in non-monetary deprivations. Next. So some of the questions that are part of this project entail: how does the triangulation of qualitative and quantitative data provide a more expansive understanding of poverty in general? And then how does a mixed methods approach explain poverty on the west side of Chicago in new ways that we haven't documented yet? And how can a feminist mixed methods project about poverty help in creating anti-poverty solutions? And as you can see here, the quantitative methods using the ACS will capture the measurement of poverty and deprivations, specifically through earnings. And then the qualitative methods has interviews will capture the lived experiences of these individuals. So one of my main arguments that I'm trying to make is that both qualitative and quantitative approaches are useful in creating a holistic perspective on poverty in the US. However, little research has been conducted that applies both qualitative and quantitative methods simultaneously. So for this presentation, I will be focusing on the quantitative perspective, but I can certainly answer questions if you have questions about the qualitative component of this project. So a quick overview of what I will be covering is a brief overview of the literature review on what work has been done with the multidimensional deprivation index, its origins, where it comes from, and how it works. Moving on to the methodology component, and then specifically looking more at the methods. So I also wanted to provide a quick definition of what is the multidimensional poverty index. So it's a measurement that reflects relevant non-monetary aspects of poverty, including food insecurity, unemployment, dilapidated housing, lack of healthcare, and limited education levels. So in other words, what the MPI does is it provides a comprehensive method for understanding poverty, because individuals may have income above the poverty threshold but are still depriving other dimensions such as education, housing, or health. So what the MPI is really trying to get at us to move away from is thinking how both quantitative and qualitative, and specifically more, how can we measure poverty in non-monetary ways? So some of the work that has been done in regards to this MPI work stems from mostly from the University of Oxford, by Sabina Alkire and Foster. In the US specifically, Brian Glassman, he wrote and published an article called The Multidimensional Deprivation in the U.S. 2017 American Community Survey Reports through the U.S. Census Bureau. So the work in the US has been done has been very limited and it's fairly new. As you can see, these are two of the major publications, most recently publications that have been conducted focusing in applying a multidimensional poverty measurement in the US. So what the MPI is really making us understand is that we need to measure how people are poor through non-monetary deprivations, and or also that we need to measure how people are both monetarily poor and non-monetarily poor simultaneously at the same time. So this measurement also gets at moving away and departing from concentrating on the means of living to the actual opportunities of living. Because experiencing poverty, it's not only based on a lack of income that individuals earn, but it's also the lack of education, lack of health insurance, lack of housing stability. All of those components also contribute to the way people continue to be in poverty. So who is left behind when we are only focusing on official poverty measurements? So here I have two graphs that was published in 2019 that does a comparison between, I'm sorry, I think it's really small, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a comparison between the official poverty measurement and the multidimensional deprivation measurement in orange. So in orange, we can see that from 2009 to 2017, the measurement of people who are non-monetary deprived is higher than the official poverty measurements from the span of 2009 to 2017. And then if we look at the next graph, we can see that you can click next. We can see that in 2019, using the ACS survey of 1 year data, this graph shows the percent of total population in each poverty deprivation, including the multidimensional poverty index, the official poverty index, both and neither, right? So what's important about this graph is that the MDI group really focuses on how, for example, the percentage, hold on, it's so small, I can't even really see it. I think is 6.8% are the individuals that are non-monetary deprived that are not accounted for in the official poverty measurements. And these individuals are a group that might be above the poverty threshold, and through the OPM, the official poverty measurement, they're not considered to be in poverty. But if we measure the deprivations through the MPI, then we can see that they're still deprived, right? So these are the people that are left behind and not accounted for. So you might be asking, well, how are these deprivations measured, right? So the Alkire-Foster method is a dual cutoff point method. There are three main areas of consideration, like the head count ratio, the weighting, and the dimensional decomposition. So based on the work that already has been done in the US, the multidimensional deprivation involves following a six-step method. So first we have to determine what are the MDI dimensions. We need to set the cutoff points for each dimension. Some, you can click next. Some that I mentioned each person is deprived in, and decide on how to weight each dimension. And then set a second cutoff point that determines what share of weighted dimensions a person must be deprived of in order to be in multidimensional deprivation. And then some of the individuals who fall into this definition of deprivation divide this value by the total population. So there's this conducting this index. I think some of the presenters also mentioned it is like a very lengthy process, as I'm sure many of you know. I attended the summer school hosted by Oxford University last summer. It was a 2-week training that taught us how to implement and create this index to measure non-monetary deprivations. So with that said, we can take a whole class on how this index works, but here we only have 15 minutes, so I'm trying my best to really concise this measurement and how it works. So here, generally looking at the uncensored headcount ratio, so if we imagine a society with only 4 people, right? The ones highlighted in red means that this person, so person number 2, is deprived in assets, right? And person number 3 is deprived in assets, meaning they might not own a home, years of schooling, right? There's minimum years of schooling. The sanitation in their home is not to the accurate measurement where it tells us what is appropriate sanitation for someone to have a well-being of life. And then access to electricity, right? There's no access to electricity. So we can see that person 3 is deprived in 1, 2, 3, 4 dimensions, right? So then how are we measuring these deprivations? So with the headcount ratio, what is really telling us is giving us, you can click next, is telling us the percentage of people who are multidimensionally poor. But however, one of the critiques of this headcount ratio is that there is an additional deprivation. So for example, if there is an additional deprivation for one person, the headcount doesn't change. So then what we need to do is create and apply an adjusted headcount ratio, where the headcount ratio tells us how the shared total number of deprivations are experienced among the poor. And that would create an accurate increase of poverty. So it would change. So again, right, like we can take a whole class on this. So I'm trying my best to really narrow it down. So then how I will be using this in my project is I will be using the 2010 Census Puma reference map from Chicago. The code is 03523. This is a map of the Puma reference map. As you know, the PUMP's data set is the smallest it can go is 100,000 has the population. So the dimensions that I will be using based on the ACS dimensions is health, education, economic security, standard of living, social connections, and housing quality. So with health, I will be looking at, does this person have a disability, right? In education, does this person have at least a high school degree? And economic security does this person lack health insurance, right? Standard of living is housing costs as a percentage of household income, meaning like are individuals spending more than 1/3 of their paycheck in housing costs? And then social connections, meaning are they speaking English fluently? And then housing qualities, the number of persons per room in a housing unit. And then my next slide, I have the thresholds on how these are usually measured. So in health, we can see that someone is considered deprived under the health dimension if 2 or more out of the 6 disabilities of hearing, vision, cognition, ambulation are present. In education, someone might be deprived in education if they do not have a high school diploma. In economic security, someone can be considered economic insecure if the lack of any type of health insurance, public or private. So these are the measurements that traditionally have been used from people who have conducted an NPI in the US specifically. So then lastly, for my conclusion, so some of the elements that the ACS is missing is that the ACS does not account for the political voice and governance of individuals, personal activities, what kind of personal activities do people do, household assets or material possessions is something the ACS doesn't cover, and any memberships in organizations and relationship with neighbors. So my goal is to include these, I guess, these dimensions by qualitative methods. So interviewing people, because these are not included in the ACS data set. And I think overall, this project can really get us to think about the differences between the official poverty measurement in regards to the multi-dimension poverty measurement, and it can help us create a more comprehensive overview of people's earnings and living experiences in poverty. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. And we will round out with our final speaker, Joe Tasillo from the Oak Ridge National Lab.
Okay, thanks. And I'll try to share my screen. See if I can. Okay. Is that visible?
I don't see it yet.
Here, let me. Oh,
and if
sorry.
we can't get it to work, I have your presentation
Okay.
open. So.
Let me try just one more thing. Oh. Okay. How about now? Is that? Can you see my?
I saw that you tried to start screen sharing.
Okay.
And I don't see it.
Okay. Oh yeah, it looks. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay. So now is it still nothing?
Yeah, I don't.
Okay.
I do. Yeah, I do not see it.
It looks like it's timing out. Okay.
Okay, I can share, and you can just tell me when to advance.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Can you see mine?
No.
Hold on, there's one thing I need to do. There we go. Let's try that. Now can you see mine?
Yes.
Okay, good.
All right. Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Joe Tasillo. I'm a research scientist in the Human Geography group at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which sits in the Geospatial Science and Human Security Division. And today I'll be discussing a Python software stack called Likeness that we use to develop human dynamics models that bridge population activity spaces and social interactivity. That's co-developed with my colleague, James Gabalardi. Next slide. Before I get into Likeness, I want to give an overview of the broader project that it sits in, UrbanPop, which is a spatial microsimulation framework that is used to model human dynamics and leverages the American Community Survey and the Public Use Microdata Sample, or PUMS, to build these attribute-rich characterizations of people and households that span a variety of subjects, including demographics, socioeconomic status, housing, health, and mobility. Using UrbanPop, we're able to produce coupled individual and neighborhood profiles that describe how people live, simulate daytime and nighttime dynamics that let us explore how people move, as demonstrated in this panel on the right, as well as generate high fidelity agents for pattern of life simulation and more dynamic agent-based models. Next slide. So the Likeness Toolkit is a culmination of UrbanPop's history to date. Starting with its development as a residential synthetic population for the United States with a worker travel component. Next. Applications in transportation and energy analysis. Next. Ingestion of more open data from the census, including the longitudinal origin destination employment statistics to simulate worker activities. Next. Support for biopreparedness efforts across the DOE national labs. Next. And then finally, at the point where I started at ORNL, updating the inputs to UrbanPop to the most recent American Community Survey releases and developing a school travel model to supplement the worker travel model. Next. And then finally, the development of Likeness as a means of streamlining kind of everything that we've built in so far, providing a high-level interface for supporting a variety of different research aims that kind of builds all of our capabilities into a single toolkit. Next. And so the core capability of UrbanPop and Likeness is population synthesis. We start with census microdata from the public use microdata sample, which is collected for a large public use microdata area, which consists of 100,000 or more people. And each PUMA decomposes to a series of small census areas like block groups and tracts. So we exploit this geographic topology to produce synthetic populations that derived from the PUMs that, when reaggregated, faithfully recreate geographic constraints from the ACS summary file. So we create a population of synthetic households containing synthetic people, and at each level, these are linked to actual records from the PUMs. Next. So Likeness carries on these capabilities for synthetic population generation and small area estimation, and enhances them using based on real-world travel along transportation networks to a variety of essential activities, including work and school, as well as social, recreational, and health-seeking activities. On the right here, we have the core workflow diagram from Likeness, where just like in the previous slide, we start with public use microdata. We downscale it to small neighborhood areas, then generate agents and send them on trips to these essential activities. And at each step of the way, we have a variety of Python packages that we've developed to support these activities. Next. So just a closer look at the likeness ecosystem and the Python packages that are included. The first stage of our workflow begins with a coupling of live-like, which is a package that wraps our population synthesis activities, and PyMetam, which wraps our spatial allocation of the microdata to small census areas. So in our first step, we create a symbolic representation of a puma, which consists of individual level constraints derived from the census microdata API and geographic constraints derived from the ACS summary file 5-year API via the census data package. We send those to PyMetam for spatial allocation. PyMetam is an implementation of a model called penalized maximum entropy asymmetric modeling, which, as I mentioned previously, our goal is to faithfully recreate the ACS summary file. We do so not in terms of the actual estimates of our constraints, but on the margins of error on those constraints. And this allows us to produce infinitely many different realizations of a synthetic population that the ACS summary file could reasonably decompose to. When we've finished our spatial allocation procedure, we pass those results back to live-like, generate agents at realistic residential locations. Then we build a transportation network based on our area of interest derived from OpenStreetMap for driving, bus, bike, and walk modes. Using the move-like package, and then finally we use the act-like package to perform activity allocation using a modified version of the transportation problem to kind of optimally send people to activities in a way that matches destination capacities. Next slide. So next I want to cover some research highlights over the past couple of years that likeness has supported. The first of these is purely residential, so non-mobility based, focused on neighborhood riskscapes, health, and power outages related to winter storms that affected Texas in early 2021. So this effort involved generating a neighborhood typology for Harris County based on individual and social, coupling individual and social vulnerability. So it's a bit small, but this table on the lower left shows 10 neighborhood categories in the columns, and then a variety of individual themes of vulnerability on the rows, which describe kind of the modal type that of individual vulnerability that individuals in our synthetic population for Harris County would be expected to be associated with most closely. And as an external validation procedure, I applied, I compared this typology to the CDC places estimates of health outcomes in different census tracts within Harris County. And so by combining these two results, we can see that places with kind of higher social vulnerability, especially related to an increased prevalence of independent living difficulty, tend to be places that also experience reduced health status and greater incidences of chronic disease. And so when we're planning for infrastructural outages, these factors might be considerations for mitigation strategies. Next slide. Yeah, so as I mentioned, that previous example was purely residential, but we're also interested not just in where people live, but also the kinds of spaces that they access, the interactions that they have across the course of the day that influence their circumstances, individual and collective circumstances, especially towards spatial accessibility and equity. So to support this, we also need some realistic residential locations to begin generating trips. Our initial approach was based on randomly allocating household locations based on census block density, but we're moving into matching our synthetic households to FEMA's USA Structures database which consists of building labels for structures in the US over 450 square feet. And so this is carried out by conflating the dwelling type label that's attached to each synthetic household in our synthetic population to a structure based on its own housing type label. Next slide. And so here's a foundational example that we developed last year for our mobility and accessibility analysis, simulating travel of students to public and private schools in Knox County, Tennessee. This example just looks at a single slice of the student population. These are 10th grade public school students. Each of these black dots is a synthesized household location. And each of the colored circles is a high school with varying capacities. And so we use the transportation problem to allocate students to these high schools along the OpenStreetMap road network for Knox County based on the enrollment capacities of those schools. Next slide. We also examined facility occupancy of the same schools in Knox County for workers, in this case, educators in public schools, by linking the PUMS attribute for the time of arrival at work to each agent, and then incrementing it by the linked hours worked per week divided by 5, assuming a typical 5-day work week. And when we do this, we can begin to pick out kind of different temporal dynamics in facility occupancy. Educators arrive rapidly to schools between the hours of 7 and 9 a.m. and then more gradually depart after 3 p.m. when schools let out. Next slide. We also examined mobility in terms of access to essential activities, namely COVID-19 healthcare services like vaccination and testing centers. In this case, we examined Lincoln, Nebraska, which is a compact mid-sized city, which gives us kind of a controlled example for mobility simulation. So we start with a synthetic population of at-risk food service workers during COVID. And we're interested in simulating their commutes to a variety of different food service job locations and understanding and counting the number of healthcare services that are available to them along those commutes. Next slide. So this panel on the right gives us the count of healthcare services that are available to each worker about their commutes to and from home. On the bottom panel, split up by travel modes, driving, biking, walking, and approximated public transit. Our takeaway from this exercise was that the greatest access to COVID-19 healthcare services tends to be for commutes into the downtown core, as well as along major commercial arteries in the city, and that access tends to decrease with urban intensity, particularly on the fringe of the city. Next slide. So going forward, we're hoping to kind of borrow from all of these different capabilities that we've built up for likeness and begin to model 24-hour synthetic populations. So that will require ingesting new ancillary data sources like time use and travel surveys to understand travel behavior by different demographic and socioeconomic cohorts, incorporating a wider variety of POI popularity types by modeling demand from data sources like popularity curves, thereby allowing us to generate synthetic activity schedules for our synthetic populations and model activities in a way that allows us to generate more complex outputs approximating human dynamics in social systems like social contact networks and occupancy. Next slide. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'll welcome your questions and feedback.
Thank you, Joe. And I have a couple questions. I'm going to jump right into them for time since we have only a couple minutes left. So the first one is for Linda. Emma Seafray asked, what kinds of corrections do you make for underreporting in the ACS?
Great. I will try to answer quickly. So what we do is that for the programs that are reported on in the ACS, for example, SSI and also cash assistance, we start from the people and households who report the program and who appear to be eligible for the program, and that's the base of our simulated caseload. But then from among the people and households who appear to be eligible who did not report the benefit, we assume that some of those actually did get the benefit in order to get up to the real world actual caseload. And we select from those eligible non-reporters to get up to the actual caseload, not only in terms of the numbers, but also in terms of getting the right characteristics. That's the short answer. I'll be happy to talk via email about the long answer.
Awesome. And then the other question I have is for Julia. So Gwen Dobson asked, I have a clarification question for Julia. First, thank you for the wonderful presentation. The multidimensional poverty measures you used can only be calculated using the PUMs. Is that correct?
Thank you for your question. No, you can actually use other data sets. However, it does make it a little bit more challenging and difficult to create a matchup. So the reason why I'm using only the ACS, because I'm interested in having all of the dimensions match the 100,000 individuals that are part of the PUMS data sets. So you can incorporate you can do a cross comparison if you're using other surveys with the ACS. For me personally, I'm just sticking with the ACS.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia. And thank you, everybody, for attending. If there are no further questions, just a reminder that the recording of this presentation and slides will be made available to all of you attendees. So thank you so much, and I hope you guys all enjoy the rest of the conference.